Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Karl from Tridec, and today it kicks off our 22nd annual Economic Outlook, where we talk about what's coming up in this next year for 2021. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first guest speaker today. Chris Green is the Assistant Director for Economic Development and Competitiveness for the State of Washington Department of Commerce. Hey, Chris.
Hey, good afternoon. Good to be with you, Karl.
It's great. I really appreciate you coming on this afternoon. I was just thinking, we call this Coffee with Karl because we usually do it in the morning on Fridays, and now it's Tuesday afternoon. So we usually talk about coffee or what we're drinking just as a way to, kind of an icebreaker, kick it off. And
yeah,
I didn't come prepared at all, but I do have my water bottle. I'm drinking water now, and I just have to, if I'm going to, start our casual conversation off, I have to say that when I put ice cubes in this water bottle, it's great. It'll hold stuff cold for like 2 days, but getting an ice cube that comes out of our refrigerator or freezer into this it's really a problem. So I don't know if you got anything that you want to talk about water or anything you drink.
Well, it's too early for anything good probably, but I'm drinking an iced coffee in a jar. So you probably can't see it because of my background, but it's got you can easily get ice cubes into a jar, Karl. So at these new inventions they have these days.
I see. I'm learning something already from you, Chris. This is a good conversation.
Absolutely.
Well, let's talk a little bit about you and your department in Department of Commerce. Or do you call it a department, or do you call it a branch, or?
Yeah, we're like the agency term would be a division. So I manage a division of the Department of Commerce. Correct.
That's awesome. And how long you been doing it? And tell us about yourself. Like what'd you do before, and how did you get into what you're doing today?
Sure. I've been at Commerce 5 years. So I'm an assistant director. So I report to our boss, Director Lisa Brown. And so I manage the Office of Economic Development and Competitiveness. And so we do a number of things, including work with the ADOs quite a bit. Before that, I actually worked at an ADO. I worked in Tacoma, which is where I still live. So I was there, around 7 years or so, and did a lot of business retention expansion work. Helped launch an aerospace kind of cluster locally there years ago, and started really engaging with WEDA, the Washington Economic Development Association. So became a board member there and started doing some legislative work with WEDA. So that's how I kind of got engaged a little more with some of the partners around the state. And then, before that, I had worked for on some federal lobbying work with some lobbyists, and had worked in the state legislature years before that. And so I kind of been bouncing around state government and politics and economic development. But so far, so good at Commerce. They haven't gotten rid of me yet.
Well, I'm just a year into this job, and I got to tell you, you're doing a great job. Like, it's really through Washington Economic Development Association, WEDA. You join us every Friday, especially during COVID. We have those updates, and it's great just to interface with you and your team at Commerce. You guys are really good to work with.
Feelings mutual, absolutely.
No, it's a great relationship, and maybe to kick us off, can you just describe what is an ADO that Tridec is for the Tri-Cities, and how does that work? And then just talk a little bit about your division, about the areas within Department of Commerce that you guys are responsible for.
Sure. So, ADO, it kind of is just a relic of, some statutory language from years ago. It's an associate development organization. And, colloquially, these are economic development councils mostly, and other places call them different things around the country. They call them EDOs, economic development organizations. But in our state, the statute allows for every county to designate who their ADO will be. And of course, in your guys' case, both counties have selected have Tridec, have for years. There's a couple other places like that. So total, we've got 35 ADOs around the state. And there's a special relationship with Commerce. We are the administrator of some ADO funding that comes from the states that goes through our team and my shop. And so we get that out to all the ADOs every year and have a contract and some reporting and deliverables there. But beyond that, beyond just the mechanical and statutory nature of our relationship, I think it's a really, really important relationship to me. Not only because I worked there for a little while, but there's some things the state is probably good at and can do, and there's some things that we're probably not good at. And so to me, this is a real partnership and symbiotic relationship. And a really, really important part of that is the great work ADOs do to work with businesses locally and do business retention and expansion. Can you imagine if someone from the state government wanted to come and meet with every company around the state all the time? I don't know how well that would go over. So that part of the work, to me, is paramount when we talk about growing economies. That really good core BRE work. So that's really important. And of course, there's many other things. The work that we do together. I know, Karl, we're working on one right now, big recruitment project. We need partners on those kinds of things. And just as often, I think Tridec has brought in projects to Commerce, and you guys have gotten them over the finish line. And we were kind of a side note, which is great too. And so there's a lot of, I think, synergy, a lot of reason to work together to kind of think about economic development as a partnership.
You bet. Well, like I said, great, Chris, it's great to work with you, and I appreciate your background that you've kind of walked a mile in the ADO shoes. So you understand, and that means a lot in the relationship, because as any relationship, it goes both ways. And we appreciate everybody on your team too. I think, one of the things that, and I'll bring up a housekeeping issue first. Anybody that's watching us on Zoom, if you want to ask a question of Chris about economic development in the state of Washington, you can ask it using the question and answer box. And if you're on social media, you can put your question in the comments, and we'll do our best to, kind of work some of those questions into the conversation if there's something that you want to ask. But how about the work that Commerce has led, and we've partnered on a couple of these different projects on taking both state funds with the first round of the Working Washington grants, and then also the federal funds under CARES grants on small business grant programs. Can you kind of give us an overview of that and just some general idea of those programs and what your team's really been focused on this last year?
Sure, and I'll just take a brief moment. I didn't hit I just realized I didn't hit part of your last question, Karl, so forgive me. I need more coffee.
Oh, that's great.
Apparently. But so yes, this has been a very different year for everybody, obviously. But in normal times, what our team is doing, OEDC, we're working on doing recruitment, business development. So we're out there around the country, we're out there around the world. And sometimes ADOs are going with us some of these places, trying to market the state and get more investment into the state. That's a big part of our program. We've also got a part of our program that is really helping small businesses try to get to new markets and export. That's a big deal for our state, very trade-focused state. And so we know getting small businesses to export for the first time or find a new market is a really important activity. It helps businesses stay around longer. So, we're usually doing those kinds of things. And we've got our sector lead program too. So we've got high-level folks looking at each industries, aerospace and clean tech, and working on public-private partnerships and trying to think about policy issues and trying to be that sort of liaison between the private sector and government to try to make good policy and make things happen. So those are the kinds of things we're normally doing. And the last year, we've dedicated a significant portion of our focus to COVID, and we've had to really focus on relief. And for me, I've sort of chunked this out into 3 buckets of work that we've had to do and think about. And this isn't an official paradigm for what every state did or what our state did, but for us, there was this immediate reaction where we had to really just focus our work on, okay, what does it mean? What's an essential industry? How do we work with the governor's office and partners to figure out who can operate? How do we make sure construction companies can operate? There was a lot of work that went into that our team participated in, working with health officials, looking at data, trying to figure out, we're the folks saying, hey, let's see how we can make this work and get folks open. So there was a lot of that, just us all reacting and trying to understand what happened. And then it became, and this is phase 2, which was kind of relief. How do we get relief out? And so federal money came, there was some state money. And what quickly became apparent to me was different than any other recession that we've seen in recent memory. This is a small business recession. And so we quickly saw some distinctions between the experiences industries were having. Of course, leisure and hospitality has had a very difficult time throughout the pandemic. Many small businesses, many restaurants, bowling alleys, fitness centers, and I could go on and on. That is a different experience than some much larger companies have had. And so how do we get relief out to those companies? And so managing through those grants has been a really large part of our work. And I know you know this because we've been working with you guys on it too. And it's not been the simplest thing. I think Commerce was trying to make some choices and balance a couple of really important things. One is, how do you get money out in a way that is in a proper stewardship of what state government is supposed to do, to make sure it's done correctly with accountability, and you make sure money gets to the right place. That is one side of the equation. And the tension it butts up against is, we don't have time to do a normal government process on some of these things. We're in a pandemic. We have to act quickly. And so how do you make some justifications to do things outside of the normal pattern of what a government would do just to try to move money? And so those are some of the things that I think have been on our mind about how we do this. And we're not out of the woods yet. We've still got a little more in this middle phase of relief. We have some more grant funds that we expect to come to the department. We'll get out to small businesses. And we're also looking at the long term. So that's out of this third phase, this long-term recovery. What does that look like? And again, very odd recession compared to the one that's on most of our minds 12 years ago. We can all see what Wall Street is doing. We can see what those markets look like. We can see how much capital is still moving on some of these really big industries. So what does recovery look like to help the small business ecosystem thrive again, help people start up companies again, and give them some resources to take that risk and start new companies, but also still do the things that we know we need to have a really strong, dynamic economy over the next 40 years. And those are things like, chasing the clean tech industry, working with PNNL, and thinking about things like quantum computing, and thinking about this life sciences industry that's been gone through the ringer and is doing really well right now. How do we cultivate those things in the state and continue to have this really globally dynamic and diverse economy for everybody's kids? So we've got to do that now. And I know you and I are working on some of those things, but those are the kinds of things that we've got to kind of focus on while we're still doing relief and pumping money out. And so that's a little bit long, but that's kind of the experience, how I characterize it over the last year for us.
No, but I appreciate you going into that detail, because you just gave a good overall view instead of just talking about the grants. You're talking about, what led into it and the essential industries. And because, I think for everybody, for you guys working at the state level, for us at the local level, it's just been this process to even look back now over almost a year. I think regardless of where anybody stands on issues or, opinions and stuff like that, like, this is something that we've never been through before. And I know it's an overused term, but I think at the same time, we have to consider, like, hey, this is new ground for everybody. And are we gonna make perfect decisions every time? No, we're gonna do the best that we can and try to quickly modify them and make them better as we go on. And I think that you just hit that with that description. So I think that's realistically where we are. And it's really, really tough. If you own a small business that's been closed down or been, open and closed, kind of been through those cycles, can't even comprehend what that's like and how impactful that is. But at the same time, we got to know that we're all working together. We're trying to do the best. And like you said, even on a recessionary level, like, there's no historical precedence for the impact on small businesses, where traditionally it's going to be your base employers, your base industries that are impacted. And so it's a new deal for everybody. Yeah, for sure.
That was I'm glad you inserted the New Deal associated with a recession. That was a good pun. I appreciate that.
It just rolled off my tongue. I didn't even catch
That was great. It was perfect. I loved it. I appreciated it.
Well, how about some of the, we just talked about some of the things that we do work on together. And as we're talking about economic outlook, and Chris, you've shared this with us a few times. So can you talk about what you see developing in industries like you mentioned, clean tech and life sciences? And what do you see coming down the pipe as far as like new investment, and, the opportunity to really expand our economy statewide and then locally here in the Tri-Cities too?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, it's been somewhat interesting. And I think back to, and for folks who are around, remember this, the last recession, there was if you were working on recruitment or pipeline or business development, all of that went on hold for a long time. And there was kind of fits and starts of there seeming like there was some more activity and site selectors popping their heads up and wanting to do big projects, but it was quiet. And that had not been the case, right? That run up from 03 to 07 was pretty busy. Then you had this big sort of slowdown. So the capital that was moving at that time slowed down quite a bit, probably a product of the dynamic of that recession that was heavily impacted the financial markets, right? So banks had to go through a reset. So fast forward to now, and this is just our perspective, I don't think our team has seen a really big change in the inflow of projects. So companies asking about doing a big deal. So we've still had over the last year, we've got at any given time, we're tracking a couple hundred projects, and maybe 60 of those are somewhat serious. But the amount of dollars that are still out there from either from private equity or venture capital or other assembled capital, they're still ready to spend and willing to spend. And some of the things, I think that there are opportunities on right now for our state, certainly are on clean technology. And that's a product of a couple of different things. It's a product of some of the international markets and tariffs and where you can buy solar cells, batteries, and how does that look like in our relationship with China. But also, the direction that the country wants to take as we think about climate change, and the administration makes priorities and where they spend money, where grants are available. And you all are familiar with this too, through various kind of new energy modes. We think there's going to be more of those kinds of opportunities and more energy around it, especially when you think about some of the national security dynamics around having local control of your energy production and other kinds of really important equipment. So yeah, we do think there will be more capital assembled and spent on big clean tech projects. So we think that's a good opportunity for the state. We still have, if not the cheapest, one of the cheapest locations for energy. And we think about the high energy utilization of a battery or a cell manufacturer, we're a great place to look at. And Tennessee and some other places have some pretty cheap power rates too. So I think there's still big opportunity there. And then you think about life sciences. I wouldn't say right now that Washington State is as mature or robust as the Boston area or San Diego, where you've got these big R&D centers around this industry. But we've got a pretty good industry here, and we've got some nodes of that developing, certainly in the Seattle and the King County area and Snohomish County. But Clark County is seeing a little more of that work. Spokane is seeing a little more of that work. And there's some really great things going on in the Tri-Cities too. And I know that the folks at P&L are thinking about this stuff quite a bit. So that's an interesting one for us too. And then you go beyond that. I just one more step, and you think about our history being known as an aerospace industry for 100 years. And no need to dwell on all of the challenges that industry has right now, particularly in the commercial aerospace supply chain. But it's not, that those things don't just go away. We are going through a period right now where there's a bit of a reset for various reasons, including a trade war. But all of that talent, all that skill, all that equipment, all those folks, all that know-how still exists here. And we're going to still build planes. And there's a bunch of other things happening too. Electric aviation there's a lot of money being spent there now. And we've had a couple of companies do some expansions in that field. I think there's, the space industry. A lot of that is in the Puget Sound, but there's opportunities all around the state right now. There's a lot more money being spent in that same sort of discipline of work that we just happen to have lots of expertise around. And when you combine that kind of know-how, that manufacturing and industrial acumen that we've developed over that period of time with, an incredible ICT industry in this state, you start to think about having some dynamics in Washington that are like Tokyo or a few other places in the world where you've got this grand excellence in manufacturing combined with what you really need for manufacturing to work in the future, which is incredible technology and all the things that go along with that without going into all the details on AI and IoT. Now you're talking about the recipe for what can be continuing to be a really dynamic economy. And all those industries I mentioned, except for commercial aerospace, there's money being spent there. There's more investment being made. There's new technology, and there's demand for some of those products. And so those are the reasons why I think it's still pretty exciting to be here right now, although we're going through a very difficult period. I think there's a lot of opportunity for the state to grow into each of those industries. And those are just the ones I mentioned. I could go on and on about a handful of others.
No, I think that's a great overview. I think it made me think of, obviously Seattle, the Puget Sound is really known as a technology center, right? And we know there's these tech centers around the United States, and obviously they all started with Silicon Valley, Seattle, Austin, Boston, some of the other ones that you talked about. And I know that like in economic development circles, it's always kind of bannered about like, well, what caused Seattle to grow? What caused Silicon Valley to be successful? And then, I think with COVID, remote working and everything else, like, do you have any ideas or thoughts about like, for a community like the Tri-Cities, how can we, even attract like maybe somebody that wants to get into a less dense, urban environment? We've seen that, read articles about New York City with COVID and stuff, like people are kind of getting out of living so close together and stuff. So any ideas or thoughts or discussions that, along those lines, and I just thought of it when you were talking about that, but and I think for the state, it's like, well, let's keep them in Washington, right? Let's like, don't let them go to Texas or someplace like that. But, how do we keep them in Washington and still connected into that hub of technology that we have in the Puget Sound area?
Yeah, I think you're hitting on a really, really important issue, Carl. Thanks for just kind of raising it. If you take the tech industry just as an example, there have been some companies that have, diversified outside of Seattle, looked at some other markets. There's still some inflow of some of those larger tech companies from places like Silicon Valley as they think about what makes sense for their business model and expanding to Seattle. And the ones that are in Seattle that are doing the same, they're going through their sort of life cycle, they're growing, and largely they're not growing to other places inside of Washington State. They're going to other hubs. So there's Detroit, there's Salt Lake City, there's Austin. We keep hearing Texas is having a good run about attracting some more. So there's these opportunities around the country. Amazon, HQ2, selects New York and Virginia, and I think a little bit in Tennessee as well. So that's the life cycle that they're going through right now as the leaders of those organizations make those choices. And you're exactly right. We've been talking about this for a while and trying to develop strategies of, okay, so does it need to be Detroit or Austin? Could it be the Tri-Cities or Spokane or Tacoma? What does it take? Yeah. What do we need to do those things? What has been interesting about this pandemic is everybody got to see really quickly how easy it could be any of those places because of the way we're doing our work, the way we're having this conversation right now. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for the Tri-Cities specifically because A, it's just absolutely gorgeous, and why wouldn't you want to be there? And B, because you've got all these sort of research institutions, you've got some assets sort of nearby that make it worthwhile to attract folks. And so what that means, companies are going to want to pick up and put office and satellite locations in those places, or sort of adopt the remote work strategy to just find the best and the brightest talent pool from different places. I don't know. I think, we've been watching, I think what I would refer to as a lot of like knee-jerk headlines mid-pandemic, where people were prognosticating that, office space is dead and everybody's selling their office space. And so I don't think the story's fully told there, because every time I see a headline like that, I see Facebook take another, big chunk of office space in Seattle or Bellevue. And so I don't think that's fully settled. I think we'll see. But I think we will see a lot more adaptability and a lot more flexibility wanting to be offered to workers. And so, totally. I think the Tri-Cities has a great story to tell about attracting more of that work to happen there through remote work or through satellite locations in the future.
That's a great, I appreciate your thoughts on that, because it's something that, not just here, I think everywhere you go, everywhere I've done economic development, it's always that discussion, because everybody wants technology jobs. It's, doesn't take any infrastructure. It uses office space. It's, high paying. It checks all these boxes. So everybody talks about it, but I think it's a good discussion for us to have. It's like, hey, how can we partner on this and at least keep them in Washington State and not, try to headhunt people out of Seattle by any means. But it's it's a good discussion. And I appreciate your shout out to the Tri-Cities and the beauty and, the 400 days of sunshine right now in Tri-Cities, and even your background of the winery. You'd mentioned talking about some of the coming into the pandemic and the discussion around hospitality and tourism. And I don't even remember if that's part of what your division covers or not, but I think that, we talk about it locally, and we've even brought it up in WIDA about that connection in between, like in our case, Visit Tri-Cities and Tridec working together on, in so much in attractiveness and recruiting today that we all deal with, it's about how livable is your community? What are the amenities that you have? And anything that we can work on that brings tourists in, like anything that a tourist wants to come here to do, also make our quality of life better for people that live here and the interconnection of that. But you want to talk a little bit about that? And I apologize, I don't remember if you guys cover tourism or not. I don't think you do, but you brought it up before and it made me think of that, because they're kind of related, right? If we're trying to attract remote workers from anywhere in the country, we want to be as great and as livable as we can, for sure.
Yeah, hey, I 100% agree. And just mechanically, Commerce doesn't have a tourism office. So years ago, there was a tourism office of the state. It was in EDC, or the predecessor. During the last recession, the state made some hard choices, and there was the office did not continue. What we have now is we have the Washington Tourism Alliance, and so we love working with them. They do, in recent years, have gotten a few dollars out of the state legislature, and so they have a little bit of funding, nowhere near what they would need or what other states have. And so we're an administrator and a partner with them as they deliver on some of that work. But I'll say, kind of two main thoughts. I think about tourism as an export. Take the beauty and grandeur of different parts of this state and sell it to someone else who wants to experience it. So I think there's a lot of work we could do more on, and Commerce does a little bit of this when we go to trade shows. Sometimes we work with some of the tourism folks to try to market the state. And so I think about it like that. I think about it as an instrument of economic development and job creation, like any of these other things we just talked about. But the second main thought there is this will be the hardest to recover. There's no real way around that, and it's not all because there are health and safety measures that have been put in place to prevent the spread of COVID. Consumer confidence matters, and how do you build that? How do you establish that trust? Getting the vaccines out there and distributed helps, but I already know we've talked to lots of companies that are looking at missing another summer season and pretty worried about it. This is going to be the hardest one, and it's a really important one. It's a very integral part of our state economy. And so, some of the things that, Commerce is trying to do now, and I know lots of other folks are spending way more time on this, but how do you get resources out there to the experts, the DMOs, or the tourism entities that are thinking about the plan and the strategy for how do you let people know it's safe to travel? How do you make sure there's protocols in place? How do you make sure that is communicated and everybody has this confidence built up when they go to a hotel, or they go to a winery, or they go to a park? Kind of in airports are doing that, right? These big international airports. You think about the signage you see when you go to these places. If you traveled recently, they've had to develop all kinds of new protocols. I don't think we probably need that for every hotel in the state, but we probably do need to think about what's the messaging and how do you make sure folks know, feel comfortable and safe that they can travel. So I think it's a really important one for all of us to keep thinking about and working and trying to cultivate and support, because I think there's probably more relief that we'll need to find out how to provide to the tourism industry as we think about the next year. I think it's going to be the hard one to have a full recovery, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. You talked a little bit about on the tourism question about, through the legislature, there's some help for the Washington Tourism Alliance. But speaking of the legislature, another hot topic. Do you want to run down some of the specific legislation that Commerce is supporting and following, that we're all working on together, and kind of shift into that legislative discussion?
Sure. There's I'll mention a couple of things. One is a pretty neat bill by your own Representative Benke. It's House Bill 1170. And he's was wonderful enough to reach out and ask our opinion about it really early on. And he and the chair of that committee, Chair Ryu, this is in the House Community and Economic Development Committee, really expressed a desire to try to coordinate on that. This is a bill that would establish a manufacturing industrial goal for the state. The goals of this would be to double the manufacturing and R&D jobs in the next 10 years or so. And I think that's an incredible aspiration that folks like us should be thinking about quite a bit. It also creates a manufacturing council. So Commerce would put together a group of folks that would be brought together to think about two big things: the economic development side of that coin and the workforce development side of that coin. So in one place where we'd be able to convene those bodies and business and labor and private sector folks all together to think about what kind of recommendations we'd make back to the legislature about things to improve and how to make sure we are still competitive and can grow these jobs here. So really cool bill. There's also a possibility that bill would create some additional resources for Commerce to match some funds for manufacturing projects around the state. So think about all the times, there's an SBIR grant that someone's going for, a company or an organization to do some neat stuff and needs a match. So maybe there's things that we could do there to help have some funding to do that. We generally in my department haven't had sort of money laying around to do that sort of thing. Or to think about a business that's trying to diversify. Think about all those aerospace companies that are looking at how could they sell into the space sector or the defense industry or unmanned systems, helping some things there. So we're following that bill. We think it's pretty interesting. We were really grateful to have the National Lab Director, Steve Ashby, actually testified on that bill too, which is really, really incredible. We're grateful that he did that. So there's that, and then I think there's there's a handful of other bills that I won't go into detail on that on broadband. We're hoping to get some more resources out there for broadband. So there's another part of the Commerce shop that kind of manages that. So we're looking forward to that. And I think a really big one right now, which I think is possibly going to move this week, is this next big tranche of funding and relief. And so the legislature's got a bill looking to move, I think it's close to $2 billion or thereabouts, to get relief out for a number of things, including big ticket items like rental assistance. Right now, the way the bill's written, about 240 million of that would come to Commerce and to OEDC to get more small business grants out. So this is part of the relief work that we've got to do still. So we're watching that legislation closely because we'll be administering those too. So I'd say overall, it's a pretty interesting legislative session. I've seen far fewer bills than we normally see for a budget year, and some issues that have been a little bit more complex. But we're tracking hundreds of bills to watch them through the process, and we're coming up on some cutoffs here pretty soon. So we'll see if some of them survive and kind of keep making it through the process.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. We're excited about 1172. We just had a conversation with one of our partners yesterday about business retention and expansion, locally, and just talking about what could we do depending upon which way the bill goes to stand up a local support group. And I appreciate what you said about the crossover with workforce development, because obviously manufacturing and many other sectors, that's such a huge part of not what just in Washington we're going through, but the whole country, the whole silver tsunami and the loss of skilled workforce, and how do we develop that next phase. But is that generally something that your division in Commerce works on? Is that workforce? Because obviously it's such a critical part of economic development. Is that, at least at a statewide level, do you guys have conversations with other departments to kind of work on it, not addressing it, but like what are proactive ways that we can, be more competitive?
100%. I mean, we definitely work with all of our state partners at the colleges and the Career Connect Washington work, the Washington Training Board, or the Workforce Training Board, pardon me, on how they're addressing, a multitude of these things. And there's some good things going on in our state. I've been participating recently with a number of those folks in those groups I just mentioned with the National Governors Association and learning from some other states that are doing some really neat things. So I think we had some things to offer there that group kind of looked at and I think liked, and I think we saw some things that we liked too that we maybe would emulate or steal at some point. Yeah, I mean, if you look at, area development or site selection magazine or those publications that folks like you and I probably read and are probably pretty boring for most other folks. Still one of the top reasons for choosing a location is workforce and skills. And so you all see this when it's one of the first couple of questions we get asked. And everybody thinks it's taxes, and that's the biggest thing. And usually taxes we kind of talk about usually for the end. It seems like to me, we talk about property, and we talk about workforce and energy costs and those kinds of things. So it's still highly critical. And we're not in a terrible position. Usually when we're trying to make the case to do an expansion here, we have a good story to tell about skills, programs, and the kinds of folks that we're graduating out of all of these programs that are getting a credential or certification every year. I think it's pretty good. And we're, I think, constantly at risk of falling behind. And so, we've got to maintain but continue to improve that and improve it. We do like this kind of apprenticeship model where you give younger people some options to choose in stacking credentials. How do you, make a choice or have enough information early on to try to make a judgment call about whether or not you must go through a 4-year baccalaureate program, decision you have to make when you're 17, or have a menu of options you could do that all lead to a successful career and self-sufficiency. So those kinds of things I hope continue to emerge. Doesn't mean anybody has to go into one path or another, but the more options I think we have for young people, I think we'll be better off. I will say one thing: Washington's, I think, in a better place than some parts of the country in that we usually can recruit people to come here too. So tech companies or manufacturing, depending on the level, it's if the choice is between moving to Washington and some other place, folks will come here too. Folks like to move here to do work. And so it doesn't mean we don't want to take our foot off the gas on the training and the pipeline and the development of the workforce, because we're not in a bad spot. But as I said, I'm constantly concerned that the day will come when we're not as attractive anymore in workforce, and we got to keep our focus on it. No,
totally. No, we've had this conversation many times, and I think, something that we're having some discussions, especially, in our role in economic development, where we have members that are, many of our industries and businesses locally are dues paying members. An important part of our organization is, can we work with them to get more opportunities to even take students in the K-12 system on field trips, right? And doing tours, especially like on the manufacturing bill as an example. I think it's a great one in that, a lot of times just as people, right, we need to go see and touch it and look at it. And if we at least know what it is, because we were on a tour there, then as we go through other grades and other even subject areas, maybe we have a little bit more connection. Like, oh yeah, that guy told me on that tour that if I want to have this job, programming this machine, I need to kind of focus on math and science or things like that. And that's, every community is different. I think that's a great advantage for us in the Tri-Cities. We have such diversity of, from manufacturing to different skilled trades to, all these different jobs. Proximity, to get local kids that they might drive by that factory every day. They don't know what goes inside of it, just to give them that look. And of course, statewide, same thing that we have, to be able to make those connections and just make it a little more tangible than something you read about in the book. And then to give people options that, it's not 4-year or nothing. There's all these other education and training options that are going to connect you with these great paying jobs for sure. Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, Carl, I'm on the same wavelength. I love everything you just said. I think that's, we'll keep orienting toward making progress there. But just everything you talked about giving young people a chance to see this stuff up close is incredible. And one of the drawbacks of COVID is we've probably done a lot less of that the last year. But I'm on board with you. I totally agree with that sentiment and those values.
Absolutely. Well, the next thing on my list, and you hit it on a little bit about aerospace and that transition that, when you guys have a great dashboard on like your homepage that you can go and kind of look at these indicators. And when you look at some of the job losses and gains through COVID, and you look at manufacturing statewide, and we know that's kind of tied into probably Boeing and aerospace is a chunk of it. But I know you guys are working with them on, like I said, other opportunities. But you talked about electric aviation, and, I got to think like hydrogen is an opportunity too, just, some type of renewable fuel that isn't, fossil based, that can kind of fill such a great need. But is there anything that we can be doing locally, Chris, to try to connect with that? We're not necessarily known as like an aviation hub versus the West Side or even like a Moses Lake, but, are there other opportunities for, other regions in the state on aerospace?
Yeah, it's a good point. So there's electric aviation certainly makes lots of sense. And so what's different about this is right now, the electric aviation that we're talking about growing is smaller planes, 5 to 12 seat planes, right? We haven't yet sort of begun in a serious way to talk about how do you put liquid hydrogen on a 747 and fly that around, right? So we haven't quite gotten to that point yet. But on electric aviation, the battery manufacturing that you have to do there, and somebody down there, I'm going to get way over my skis here in a minute because I know there's more battery experts in Tri-Cities than anywhere else. But my point is, it's not, I wouldn't say battery technology is commoditized. I'm not saying that at all. But when you talk about the batteries that go into vehicles like the Ford and the GM had a great commercial during the Super Bowl. I thought it was hilarious. You think about those batteries, that there's probably a sort of a different level of technology that's needed when you talk about aviation, because you've got to have lightweight, you've got to have maximum efficiency. And so there's more development that goes into those over time to make those as efficient as possible. I think that technology is going to be increasing in demand for aviation over the next 10 years. Of course, it still is going to be in high demand for all of the other sort of terrestrial needs like grid storage and automobiles and a variety of other needs for battery usage. But I think that's a really big deal. And I think a little bit about, Karl, you and I've talked about this just very briefly, but commercial space in that industry. And you think about, all of the, engineering you need to go into the development of those products, whether they are low Earth orbit satellites or they are actual rocket components that we're making, and the technology that has to be combined with that. So the software systems, those kinds of developers and engineers on the software side, building those products too. I think there's a lot the Tri-Cities has to offer in all of those areas. And so, yeah, I think that's going to continue to be a big deal. And if you just step a little bit sort of beyond aviation a little bit, solar manufacturing is going to continue to be a really, really important part of our future. And so there are some steps that have sort of been taken to allow the country to not be as beholden to solar cells that are manufactured elsewhere. Right now, almost all of the solar cells that we have on our solar panels on our roofs and other places are made in Asia, most of them in China. We import those. Are we going to be able to domestically start to supply solar cells for what is, a demand that is increasing daily around the country? And are there policies at the federal level or state level that sort of begin to nurture that a little bit more? And so I think all of those things that I mentioned, except for the software, really need high, energy usage. You've got to have good access to power, good relationship with Bonneville in your case too. So you've got to be able to provide that at a minimum. And then, what else are the things that, the Tri-Cities can do? I think it's some meat and potato things that hopefully the state can help with, but how do you get a site ready? How do you make sure something's ready to go that's plug and play? Every other state has the same issue, I guarantee it, but we've all been through this issue where a company shows up and says, I've got this huge project, I need to break ground yesterday. Right. Why can't we do that? And why can't Bonneville run a transmission line by the middle of the next month? This happens everywhere. And if we can improve our ability and our timing to get sites ready and do some of those things, that'll give us a leg up, I think, probably more than most other decision-making criteria that companies make is, do we have places they can go? So I think that those are going to be important things to think about over the next few years.
That I think you're right on. We just had a conversation about that this morning in our case management team, where we gather our economic developments from cities and ports and our other partners, and had this discussion about some of the cases that we're working on together. And it's chicken and the egg, right? With us in Bonneville and electrical power. So many of the things you just talked about, from battery production to the other clean tech, even some of the existing ones for like food processing or, food packaging, they all have big electrical needs and or natural gas. And that's a fine line to walk, right? As we head towards carbon free, whether it's seed or anything else. And how do we balance out those needs for new development and the other part of it. But what we talked about was, BPA goes, well, where's your customer? And we're like, well, we can't get the customer until we get the power there. They're going to know that we need to get it. And so I think you're right. And some of the things that we've talked about are anticipating that there may be some future federal stimulus, kind of along the lines of ARA from 2009. And if that were to happen, could we package up some of that infrastructure that we need to get to shovel ready and to site ready, and then do a lot more proactive marketing with those sites? Because to your point, if there aren't any sites that have these criteria around there, whatever we can do to get to that ready state, maybe it gives us a little bit of a leg up and work collectively, and even working with some of our partners like federal EDA, economic development, not association, agency,
administration.
Right, administration. There you go. I knew you'd know. So, how can we get better position ourselves on some of their grant programs and kind of work on that? So we're having those discussions locally about being able to do that. I was thinking, Chris, on things that you and I have talked about before that I think would be interesting for our audience to talk about this economic outlook. Can you tell us a little bit about Maritime Blue and commerce's role in kind of like building this new industry cluster, and maybe some things that we can learn in the Tri-Cities to look at some of our opportunities and partner with commerce like you guys did on that. How does something like that work?
Sure, I think it started. So Maritime Blue is a cluster organization that Commerce helped to launch with some other partners. The Port of Seattle, I'd say, has been the biggest partner and contributor. They've been a big participant, and the notion was taking in some experiences that we see around the world and how other places develop clusters. And it's not a really complicated concept. It's how do you have a whole bunch of assets in one place that leverage one another, create synergy, and then that becomes sort of an entity unto itself that can attract more energy, have more demand to bring other folks on board. So that's the idea. And for Maritime Blue, this started with folks on our team and the port thinking about, okay, how would we think about growing jobs that are in and around clean propulsion on the water? How would we think about that problem? So that was sort of a basic genesis of some of this. And then it expanded a little bit to, okay, what about the other really interesting technology, advanced manufacturing things that are sort of in and around the water, around the shoreline? And so that kind of goes, to offshore wind or other things that we might think about in our future that other countries have done. And this notion of, can you get really exceptional academic institutions to partner with government and the private sector to coordinate together to try to grow something? And so we've with Maritime Blue, this organization has sort of launched. And now its own entity. It's a fully incorporated nonprofit entity with a board and a manager and all that. And they're doing a number of things to continue to build energy. Some things are doing a capital landscape study, understanding where capital is in the world that might want to invest in this, meeting those people, coordinating those people, working with entrepreneurs or small companies that want to do demonstration projects in this space, or mid-sized companies, and then getting some seed funding from these sources to kind of get some project or demonstration projects going. So all of these things, what we hope happens over time is that more mid-sized companies or entrepreneurs think about this space as a place they can go. There's resources, there's an entity that can help sort of shepherd it along, and that folks around the world would take notice too and say, okay, I'm a electric propulsion systems company in Switzerland. We need a North American location. What makes sense? Does it make sense to go to Louisiana where there's a big boat building industry? Maybe. Does it make sense to go to Washington State where they've got a pretty good boat building industry and all of these other dynamic things that are happening around it to grow it over time? And I should have mentioned that P&L has been absolutely an exceptional partner in all of this work too, especially when we talk about the battery side and we talk about how do we develop this over time. So that's how that developed. And then we think about that made sense for that industry at the time, based on the assets we had in the state and the leaders that you had that were going to sort of be willing to put the elbow grease into it. But if you think about, could you replicate that or do that with some other industries? That's what we would like to do. We've got a few dollars from an EDA grant that the department is working through. We plan to make those available out around the state. So there'll be a competitive RFP process for that soon. The point would be to just get some seed money out regionally for folks that want to try something like maritime blue or some moderately different thing if it makes more sense. But would there be some energy around getting public, private, academic together, and maybe workforces, maybe the fourth leg of that stool, together to coordinate on something like that to generate more economic activity and come up with a plan, a strategy, just to get the idea going and put those efforts in a place where if they had a little more plan or strategy developed, could go back to DOE and DC or go back to the private market and say, hey, come invest in this. This is a good idea. This is a good plan. We can grow a cluster. We think it's a great model. We like how they've done that in Norway, where they've got sort of various stages of these, and they've got sort of smaller baby clusters and mid-sized clusters and full-blown clusters. But the point is, over time, if they get resourced right and there's really good leadership and there's good institutional support, then you can, I think, grow some of these clusters a little bit. And I think Washington's been, lucky a little bit that we've had big aerospace over the years, and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. Some of those things have really helped drive the economy in some ways for periods of time. Could you take some segments of some of these markets and try to grow that? So is it solar or battery, or maybe it's around silicon, or is it around electric aviation or space, or really agriculture technology or forest health? There's some industries that could burgeon or emerge, I think, from those that solve sort of problems for the future as well. And so we hope that we could, plant seeds that help some of those things develop. And all of that said, the money that we have from the EDA is only about $3 million. And so we will get some money out to, like I said, pre-seed some of these ideas. They will not solve it or create fully functioning clusters, but we hope to give some resources out regionally where folks could think about that if they want to. And then Commerce would want to support those ideas. So that's a long-winded answer. I could go on and on about that, but those are some of the things we're thinking about that long-term vision for how do you grow the state economy and keep it dynamic.
Yeah, I don't think that was too long at all. I think it was perfect. I think, we're almost at the end here. I was just thinking of, and you said that you did a similar talk down in Clark County. So, is there anything that you said in your slides at Clark County that you and I haven't talked about, or anything else that you'd like to leave us with?
No, I don't. Gosh, it's all a blur. I did. If anybody's interested, I think I wrote a little tiny, modest article in the Columbian to talk about some of this stuff, and so maybe that's online somewhere still. I think my thesis kind of is, we're not out of the woods. We've got work to do, and we've got to be really self-aware as economic developers, as government officials, or whatever our lot in life is right now, that there's just two different experiences in the economy. There's a small business experience, and there's sort of like folks that probably are already on the upswing. And so how do you, if anybody here is in charge of being a caretaker for industry, thinking about that, how do we respond to that need? How do we make sure small businesses can still grow and succeed and have a good way to do that? I think the one thing I did mention a little bit when I did the other event is, there are some things that are incumbent upon the state and lots of us to think about on this question around equity and, lessons learned, from lots of, we can, not to go back into history, but just to go back to the last recession and think about how did that shake out, and who had a harder time getting back to normal, finding employment, accessing federal programs or accessing sort of business startup programs. What was that experience like? And was it even? And was it equitable? And did we eliminate disparity? And so as we think about the answers to those questions, that leads us to now thinking, okay, we've yet again got a recession. And because of the way it shakes out, there's probably disproportionate impacts on some communities. What's the role of government or anybody that's thinking about this stuff to make sure we're thoughtful about that and have an equity lens when we sort of try to get a relief out there and try to think about the economy. So that goes both for small business support, but it also goes for jobs of the future and making sure we've got pipelines and we're accessing all of the talent that is in this state, making sure everybody's got a fair shot. So those are probably really important tenets of the state's point of view on how do we make this work and do a better job than we did last time.
That's a great point, and I appreciate you bringing it up because there have been so many conversations that we've all been a part of, and it's really a critical part of that recovery. And even I think it's kind of another example of the challenge that you guys face every day when you're working with all of these ADOs throughout the state that might be one county that's pretty small to King County, or where we're kind of in the middle towards the larger size. Everybody's different. You guys have to maintain that relationship, because I think even with that lens of equity, the reality of it is some of our rural counties, versus some of our urbans, that they just don't have the same opportunities that we have to, access to workforce or infrastructure or these things. And so when you look at, even like big projects, there's only certain places in the state that those big projects are going to land. And then what can we all do to help support our, rural partners? And it really is very wide and very deep. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And Chris, I think we're going to give you a few minutes back, maybe one or two. I think you got another meeting to jump to, but I want to thank you on behalf of Tridec for joining us today. This is a great conversation, and, really appreciate your time and kicking off our economic outlook for 2021.
Well, Carl, hey, when you called, I was excited to do it. I just love working with you guys and the team. So thanks to everybody for all the partnership. And I wish I could get back down there, get out of this gloomy Tacoma weather I'm in all the time, because I love being able to come down there and visit and meet companies and see what we can do to help. So I appreciate all the partnership, and I know we'll be talking a lot more.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks again. We can't wait to host you when we get through COVID and we come back. And for everybody out there watching us, we will have our regular scheduled Coffee with Karl Friday at 9 o'clock. We'll have Aisha Soljuk from, she's our regional economist, and she'll kind of give us an economic outlook as well. So Chris, thanks again. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll be talking to you.
Very good. Thanks, Carl. See you.
All right, thanks.